Okay, let's talk about JFK's administration. First off, JFK established a significant legacy in terms, even though, especially because he only was president for 2 years, right? He's elected in 1960. He's not sworn in until 1961, and he was assassinated in 1963, right? So, first off, he was the youngest president ever to be elected. He was 43 when he was elected in 1960. He's also the first Catholic president, which may not seem controversial now, but it was a significant issue during his campaign because every president before him was Protestant. He does come from a pretty prominent political family, right? So, he's from Massachusetts. His family was wealthy, and this does affect his decision to choose a Southern Democrat, Lyndon Johnson, to be his running mate. He ran against Richard Nixon in 1960. We'll talk more about the election in the next slide. It's significant, first off, that he is definitely appealing to the youth. We could compare him to Obama's presidency in that sense. When he campaigned, he talked about a new frontier, which was sort of alluding to the idea that political leadership, the torch was being passed to them. And he also leaves a significant legacy in his ability to avert a major crisis with one of the closest threats to nuclear war that we ever saw, with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And also, in terms of his domestic policy, he is not tremendously successful, but he does propose a lot of liberal reforms. And what we're going to see is that even though Congress prevents a lot of those from passing when JFK is president, when Lyndon Johnson takes his place, he actually is able to fulfill a lot of JFK's legacies and actually pass these laws. JFK supported efforts to improve employment and equality for women. He also stimulated the economy through his fiscal policies, and he committed the country to expanding its manned space program. We see this with his pledge to land a man on the moon, which does not happen during Kennedy's lifetime, but it does happen in 1969. He also significantly strengthens the executive branch during his presidency. So how does Kennedy win the election of 1960? Actually, despite his legacy and popularity in history now, he did not win against Nixon by an incredibly wide margin. If you look at the popular vote, they were very close. And he does not, it's definitely not a landslide in terms of the electoral vote either. In some ways, we see that even though Eisenhower, the previous president, even though he was fairly popular, remember that he was moderate. So in a lot of ways, it doesn't show us a total party realignment. Eisenhower was just sort of a brief turnover for Republicans. And in a lot of ways, we could say that Eisenhower's presidency was more symbolic of Truman's lack of popularity than it was a total shift to a Republican power, right? So JFK, again, he decides to choose Lyndon Johnson, a Southern Democrat, to sort of balance out his campaign and give him more Southern support. It's also important for us to realize that television was very significant in terms of the election's outcome. In the televised debates between Kennedy and Nixon, people had a more favorable view of Kennedy. They saw him as appearing more youthful and energetic, and Nixon rather appeared kind of. He looked older, he looked tired, he looked sort of sweaty and clammy and nervous. And so people who saw those debates on TV actually, a lot of times, had a better impression of Kennedy. But again, the election results were very close in terms of the popular vote, so it's definitely not a landslide for Kennedy. In terms of his domestic policies, it was difficult for him to keep all of his New Frontier policies. He made plans to eradicate poverty, and he also wanted to elevate America's science status with the moon landing. And he also called for aid for education. He wanted federal support for healthcare. He wanted urban renewal, and he wanted more civil rights legislation. And many of these programs did not go particularly far in Congress, and a lot of this is because there was still a pretty significant conservative slant in Congress left over from the Eisenhower administration. So, for example, Congress defeated Kennedy's plans for Medicare and mass transit aid. He does have more success over his economic policies than his social ones. So, for example, he does raise minimum wage, and he provides federal grants for urban development. You also see increased spending for defense and space exploration programs, and these also stimulate the economy. But it's not surprising that these were more popular because the space race was already launched with Sputnik in 1957, so it was okay for him to spend money on that kind of defensive policy. Additionally, the Peace Corps is established in 1961, so this is an important part of his New Frontier campaign. The Peace Corps gets young American volunteers to give technical aid to developing countries. So it definitely exemplifies the idea that the youth is meant to take more of a leadership role in the future of democracy. In terms of his foreign policy, we do see a little bit of a shift from containment to more easing of tension, but he does also expand nuclear and conventional weapons by establishing a policy that was called flexible response. Essentially, what this meant was that there needed to be a little bit more attention towards more conventional weapons. So in some ways we see it kind of as a shift away from massive retaliation. So we spent more money on ground troops. One of the significant organizations that was created by the flexible response policy were the Green Berets. We see them down here. They fought a lot of battles against Third World guerrillas. And hundreds of them were sent into Indochina to try to stop communist movements in Laos and Vietnam. But these missions were not particularly successful, and so this actually is going to lead to a much greater military involvement in Vietnam when Johnson becomes president. Kennedy also supported aid to Latin America. This was exemplified in the Alliance for Progress. This is sort of like the Marshall Plan in Latin America. It gave, over the course of several years, about $20 billion in aid to Latin America. But it actually did not help the poor significantly, because if you actually spread it out among the population, it only gave about $10 of aid per person. And also, JFK did not do much to challenge the power of anti-communist dictators. We also see that in that sense, the growing fear of communism meant that, poor people in these countries really did not get that much help. Latin American countries also were unwilling to implement reforms, especially in terms of land reform. So what we see with the Alliance for Progress was the goal was to establish a positive relationship with Latin America and to inhibit the rise of communist insurgents such as Castro. What we see is that increasingly some of these countries do still, turn to communism. Obviously, the Cuban Revolution had brought Fidel Castro to power. We're going to see the epitome of the tension between the U.S. and Cuba with the Cuban Missile Crisis in the next slide. So Ike ends up cutting off aid to the Alliance for Progress, or aid to Cuba when Castro begins land reform. And the U.S. is later going to sever its diplomatic relations with Cuba. And in all, the Alliance for Progress in general in Latin America was not particularly successful. One of the major mistakes of Kennedy's presidency was to continue a plan that actually was implemented by Eisenhower. He just didn't see it through. So the Bay of Pigs invasion was something that Eisenhower's administration was already planning for. So what it was a CIA-backed invasion by Cuban. It was supposed to be by Cuban exiles. So basically, people who fled Cuba ended up in the U.S. During the Revolution. So these were capitalists that were living in places like Florida. They attempted to invade Cuba and stop communism, but it fails, and Castro ends up realizing that in order to prevent future invasions like this, he needs to ask somebody for help. So he turns to Khrushchev because, of course, Cuba is turning towards communism, and they would gain a valuable ally with the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev ends up agreeing to supply missiles into Cuba, basically to stop that threat of American invasion in Cuba. The significance of that is that basically there's going to be this possibility of an actual nuclear attack on American soil. By putting Soviet missiles in Cuba, the idea was that there could easily be a long-range attack on U.S. soil. People as far away as New York City were terrified that nuclear war would be inevitable. So basically, what ends up happening is that the U.S. orders a blockade on Cuba to try to stop the continued importation of missiles into Cuba. Eventually, the blockade works. The Soviets back down. They withdraw weapons from Cuba, and to establish some sort of reciprocal agreement, the U.S. Agrees to remove missiles from Turkey. So this is significant because JFK successfully negotiates with the Soviets and avoids a major nuclear crisis. This makes him increasingly popular. And also, it seems as though there might be an easing of Cold War tensions between the U.S. and the USSR, because in 1963, the two countries signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to end atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. One of the sources of tension, though, during this time is that the Berlin Wall was constructed. This was because Khrushchev again demanded that the U.S. would pull troops out of Berlin. They refuse, and so the Berlin Wall is constructed. But this also shows that there is sort of a weakness in the USSR, because basically, they have to actually build a physical barrier to keep East Berliners out of the western portion. So this definitely gives you a sense of the weakness of the Soviet influence over East Berlin. So Kennedy is assassinated in 1963, but what's significant is, obviously he does leave a major legacy over the United States. A lot of his policies we will see followed through with Lyndon Johnson, which is significant. So he does start to push more towards civil rights. We will see when we talk about the civil rights movement in the next series of videos that Kennedy is going to be a little bit more forceful in making sure that desegregation is actually enforced. And increasingly, it does seem like we're moving in a good direction with foreign policy. The fact that he is able to successfully negotiate the Soviets to withdraw missiles from Cuba makes the American public get a little bit more confidence in terms of foreign relations. And additionally, we do see more hopes in terms of the direction of civil rights. And then we also see a little bit of a shift away from the reliance solely on nuclear weapons with JFK's flexible response policy. Also, the flexible response policy allows the country to more easily intervene in brush fire conflicts. So that's significant as well. So that will get us all caught up with chapter 27 from the textbook. And the next series of videos will be about the civil rights movement. So those will be about chapter 28. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.